Silence has a weight in the high lonesome places. For a man like Hunter, it was more than an absence of sound, it was a shroud he'd woven for himself, thread by thread, over 5 bitter years. Each winter was a penance, each howling wind a chorus of voices he deserved to hear. His cabin, nestled in the granite teeth of the unforgiving peaks, wasn't a home. It was a tomb for a life that had ended long ago, a place where memory was the only ghost and guilt the only companion. The world below, with its frantic wants and cheap cruelties, had been banished. But the mountains, like a man's own heart, do not bargain. On a moonless night, when the blizzard was a ravenous white beast clawing at the pines, a new sound came. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate scratching at his door, a sound small and weak, yet louder than any storm. He opened it, a silhouette of ragged beard and regret against the meager lamplight, expecting a half-dead wolf. What he found was a woman, her face a mask of ice and exhaustion, who collapsed across his threshold without a word. And clutched to her chest, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, were 2 small forms, still and silent as stone. For the first time in 5 years, Hunter felt something other than the dull ache of the past. It was the sharp, piercing terror of the present. He pulled them in, all 3 of them, and bolted the door not against the storm, but against the ghost of another woman, another child, he had failed to save from the cold. This wasn't mercy. It was a reflex, the muscle memory of a man who had once been whole. Hunter worked with a grim, practiced efficiency that felt like a betrayal of his exile. He stripped away the frozen layers from the woman, his hands rough but surprisingly steady. Her skin was the color of bruised plums, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. He laid her on his own cot, a place that hadn't felt the warmth of another human in half a decade. Then he turned to the children, twins by the look of them, a boy and a girl, no older than 4. Their faces were waxen, their small chests barely rising. He worked on them by the fire, rubbing their limbs, forcing drops of lukewarm, sugared water between their blue-tinted lips. The cabin, once a silent monument to his loss, was now filled with the terrible, fragile sounds of life struggling to hold on. The woman, whose name he did not know, drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness, her murmurs a broken mosaic of fear and defiance. The spring, he can't have it, my deed. She'd whisper into the oppressive quiet. Hunter ignored the words. Words were kindling for fires you couldn't control. He focused on the physical, the heat of the fire, the steam from the kettle, the steady rhythm of a child's heart beginning to beat stronger against his palm. He was a mechanic of survival, nothing more. But as the girl's eyes fluttered open, dark and deep and full of a terror that saw right through him, he felt the foundations of his tomb begin to crack. He was no longer just a keeper of ghosts. He was a jailer, and 3 living souls were now trapped inside with him. The blizzard raged for 3 days, sealing them in a world of white. It was a purgatory. Inside, a fragile truce with death was being negotiated. The woman, Ilara, woke on the 2nd day, her fever broken, her eyes clear but haunted. She said little, her gratitude a silent, heavy thing that sat between them in the cramped space. The twins, Leo and Maya, recovered with the astonishing resilience of the young. They explored the one-room cabin with wide, solemn eyes, their world shrunk to the confines of Hunter's grief. A dead man's world, now cluttered with the small artifacts of childhood. A pinecone placed carefully on a stack of books. A smear of soot on the floorboards from a curious finger. One morning, Maya, with a piece of charcoal from the hearth, drew a shaky circle on a loose plank near the fire. A son, she whispered, for a world that had none. Hunter saw it and felt a phantom ache, a memory of a smaller hand, a different drawing, a different life. He said nothing, turning back to sharpening his skinning knife, the scraping of steel on stone the only language he trusted. But the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft patter of small feet, the murmur of a mother's lullaby, the unspoken question in Ilara's gaze. He was a mountain that had stood against the wind and ice for years, but now a single seed of life had found a crack in his stone face, and a root was beginning to grow. When the snows finally relented, the world outside was blindingly white, pristine, a lie of purity covering a landscape of brutal truths. They were low on flour and salt, and the children needed milk. Hunter knew he had to go down to Blackwood's Gulch. The name itself felt like a stone in his gut. He hadn't set foot in the town in 2 years, a place run by a man as dark as his name, Silas Blackwood. Before he left, Ilara pressed a few coins into his hand. "For the trouble," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked at the meager offering, then at her proud, defiant face, and simply nodded, the gesture feeling more significant than any words he could have spoken. The town was just as he remembered, a collection of false fronts held up by fear. The air was thick with a deference that bordered on servitude. Every storefront, from the mercantile to the land office, bore the Blackwood name. And there, nailed to the post outside the marshal's office, he saw it. A wanted poster. The ink was fresh, the drawing a cruel caricature of a woman's face. Ilara Vance, it read. Wanted for arson and theft. Burned her own homestead for profit. Dangerous. Hunter felt a cold, familiar rage coil in his stomach. He saw the townsfolk glance at the poster, then quickly look away, their silence a form of complicity. He went into the mercantile, the bell above the door a tinny, cheerful sound in the suffocating quiet. He bought flour, salt, coffee, and a large tin of condensed milk. More than a lone man would ever need. The storekeeper, a man with fear-haunted eyes, said nothing as he bagged the items. But his gaze flickered from the goods to Hunter, and in that fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. A choice had been made. Returning to the cabin felt like coming up for air after being held underwater. The clean, cold scent of pine and snow washed away the town's stench of fear. Ilara was waiting by the window, a sentinel watching over her sleeping children. He placed the heavy sack on the table without a word and pulled out the poster, laying it flat between them. The crude drawing was an insult, a lie made of paper and ink. Ilara stared at it, her jaw tight, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Then, the dam of her silence broke. The story poured out of her, a torrent of injustice. She spoke of her husband, dead a year from fever, and the small parcel of land he'd left her, a place everyone thought was worthless rock and scrub. But it held a secret, a deep, year-round spring, the only one on the entire mountain. Silas Blackwood knew. He'd found out somehow. He offered her pennies for it, then threats. When she refused, he branded her a squatter, a nuisance. The fire hadn't been her doing, it was his. An act of erasure. He wanted to wipe us away, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage, not fear. He thinks if no one remembers we were there, it's the same as if we never existed. She then went to a small, hidden pouch she wore around her neck. From it, she pulled a folded, oilskin-wrapped paper. It was singed at the edges but intact. A deed. Her husband's name, her name, clearly written, the parcel legally recorded. It wasn't just paper. It was her truth. It was the one thing Blackwood's fire couldn't burn. Power like Silas Blackwood's is a jealous god. It demands absolute fealty and cannot abide even the smallest pocket of defiance. In his mind, Ilara Vance and her children were already ghosts, their story concluded by the fire he'd set. But ghosts, he was about to learn, have a way of returning. A week after the blizzard, a grizzled prospector, half mad from solitude and chasing a rumor of gold, stumbled upon Hunter's cabin. He was given a hot meal and sent on his way, but the image of a woman and 2 small children in the hermit's fortress stuck with him. Down in Blackwood's Gulch, a few mugs of cheap whiskey were enough to loosen his tongue. The rumor slithered through the saloon and found its way, as all things did, to the ears of Silas Blackwood. The news did not please him. It was an imperfection in his otherwise immaculate narrative of control. A loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire tapestry of fear he'd so carefully woven. He didn't see a desperate woman and her children, he saw a living, breathing accusation. He saw the deed he knew she must still possess. He saw a threat not to his land holdings, but to the very foundation of his authority, which was built on the premise that his will was law, and his word was truth. He summoned his men, hired guns, and broken souls who fed on his scraps of power. Their task was simple: ride up to the mountain and extinguish the last ember of Elara Vance's existence. This was no longer about land. It was about making an example. It was about proving that in his kingdom, there was no resurrection. A change had come over Hunter. The shroud of apathy he had worn for 5 years had been torn away, and the man underneath was someone Elara did not know. He was a creature of purpose again. The haunted stillness was replaced by a lethal focus. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was preparing. He spent an afternoon meticulously cleaning his rifle, the oiled clicks of the mechanism echoing in the quiet cabin. He laid out his cartridges, polished and deadly. This was a ritual not of a hunter of deer, but a hunter of men. He took Elara outside, into the stark, white silence, and pressed a small revolver into her hand. "The kick is hard," he said, his voice low and steady. "Don't fight it. Aim for the center. Don't stop until it's empty," she learned quickly, her fear forged into a cold resolve. Inside, the children watched. Leo, the boy, saw the rifle in Hunter's hands and the grim set of his jaw, and he understood more than he had words for. He began to shadow Hunter, his small face a perfect mirror of the man's seriousness. While Hunter scanned the tree line, Leo stood beside him, peering into the distance with a child's fierce loyalty. One afternoon, he found a sturdy branch and held it like a rifle, standing guard at the cabin door. Hunter saw the boy, a 4-year-old sentinel protecting his world, and for the first time, he felt the ghost of his own son not as a weight of guilt, but as a surge of protective fury. He was no longer just protecting these strangers. He was defending the very idea of a future that had been stolen from him once before. He would not let it be stolen again. The thunder came on a day with no clouds. The rhythmic beat of shod hooves on frozen ground, a sound that meant an army was coming. Hunter ushered Elara and the children inside. "Stay away from the window," he commanded, his voice a low growl. Through a crack in the chinking, he watched them arrive. Blackwood sat on a fine black stallion, a king surveying his domain, flanked by a half-dozen men with rifles across their saddles. They fanned out, surrounding the small cabin, their movements confident, arrogant. "Hunter!" Blackwood's voice boomed, falsely congenial. "I know you're in there. I've no quarrel with you. Send out the woman, and you can return to your ghosts." Hunter didn't answer. He raised his rifle, the cold stock a familiar comfort against his cheek. He was no longer a man hiding from ghosts, he was a man standing with them. Blackwood's patience wore thin. "A foolish choice," he called out, and then a shot rang out, splintering the wood of the doorframe. The battle began. It was not a wild shootout but a deadly geometry of cover and fire. Hunter was an extension of the mountain itself, patient, implacable, lethal. He moved from window to window, a phantom marksman making every shot count. But they were many, and he was one. Elara, huddled in the corner with her children, held the revolver, her knuckles white. She was not a warrior, but she was a mother, and in that small, besieged cabin, that was a power Blackwood had fatally underestimated. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear, a storm of men trying to tear down a fortress built of one man's resolve. As the siege wore on, a grim realization settled upon Hunter. He could win this fight. He could drive them off or kill them all. But it would be a hollow victory. A win in the wilderness meant nothing. It would only reinforce his isolation, turning his cabin from a sanctuary into a permanent fortress, a prison for all 4 of them. Blackwood's power wasn't here in the mountains, it was down below, rooted in the silence of the town. Truth, he realized, is not a thing you defend in the dark. It is a thing you declare in the light. In a lull between shots, he turned to Elara. "We're not winning here," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "We win this in the town." A desperate, insane plan formed in the crucible of the firefight. Using the last of his ammunition to create a furious barrage of covering fire from one side of the cabin, he guided Elara and the twins out the back, into the dense woods. Blackwood's men, their attention focused on the frontal assault, were caught by surprise. Hunter, Elara, and the children scrambled onto his sturdy pack mule, a creature as stubborn and resilient as its owner. They didn't flee deeper into the mountains. They rode down. They rode toward the heart of the beast. They emerged from the tree line and galloped into Blackwood's Gulch, a frantic, desperate cavalry charge of the wronged. They clattered to a halt in the center of the main street, just as Blackwood and his men, realizing the ruse, came thundering in behind them. Townspeople poured out of the shops, their faces a mixture of fear and astonishment. The stage was set. The confrontation in the street was absolute. On one side stood Silas Blackwood, the architect of the town's fear, his face contorted in a mask of fury, flanked by his paid guns. On the other stood Hunter, a man who had come back from the dead, his rifle held loosely but ready. Beside him stood Ilara, her children clinging to her legs, a small, defiant island in a sea of her oppressor's rage. "This woman is a criminal," Blackwood bellowed, pointing a shaking finger. "A fugitive from justice." But his authority, so absolute in the shadows, began to feel hollow in the stark light of day. It was then that Ilara stepped forward. Her voice, though not loud, carried with the clarity of truth across the silent street. "He lies," she said, and the simple declaration was a stone thrown into a still, stagnant pond. "He wanted my land. He burned my home. He tried to kill my children." Then she held up the singed, precious deed. "This is my proof. This is my truth." The townspeople watched, their faces unreadable. For years, their silence had been a currency they paid to Blackwood for a fragile peace. Now, they were being asked to choose. It was the storekeeper who moved first, stepping slightly away from the wall of his mercantile. Then a blacksmith. A mother. A small but profound shift in the human landscape. A deputy, a young man who had ridden with Blackwood, looked from the deed to his employer's enraged face, and the certainty in his own eyes began to crumble. Blackwood saw the tide turning. He raised his pistol toward Ilara. But before he could fire, Hunter's rifle was at his shoulder, its aim steady and final. "It's over, Silas," Hunter's voice cut through the tension. And in that moment, everyone knew it was true. Power built on lies is a house of cards, and the slightest breath of truth can bring it all down. A new homestead rose from the ashes of the old, its foundation sunk deep into the earth beside a spring that bubbled with clear, constant life. The community, freed from the chokehold of Blackwood's rule, came together to build it. They were no longer a town of silent spectators but a community forged in the fire of a shared stand. Hunter was there, his hands, once used to the tools of death, now learning the rhythm of a hammer and saw. He was not a ghost anymore. The laughter of the twins, Leo and Maya, echoed in the clean mountain air, a sound that chased away the last of the shadows in his soul. He had gone into the mountains to bury his past, and instead, he had found a future. The isolated cabin, high in the peaks, was left to the wind and the snow, a monument to a grief that had finally been laid to rest. What we learn from a story like Hunter's isn't just about the courage to face down a villain with a gun. It's about the far greater courage required to face down the silence in our own communities and in our own hearts. So often, we build walls around our own pain, choosing the cold comfort of isolation over the messy, unpredictable business of human connection. We see injustice and look away, convincing ourselves it is not our fight. But silence is a choice. It is an act of consent. Ilara's story reminds us that truth, even when it is singed and fragile, has a power that no lie can extinguish. And Hunter's journey shows us that redemption is not found in hiding from our ghosts, but in finding a reason to fight for the living. Every day, in ways big and small, we are asked to choose between the cabin and the town square, between apathy and action. The question this story leaves us with is not what we would do in the Old West, but what we will do in our world, right now. Who are the vulnerable we are turning away from? What truths are we helping to bury with our silence? If this story resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more tales of grit and redemption. And in the comments below, share a time you saw someone break the silence. Let's build a community that chooses courage over comfort, every single time.